Now the next presentation will be from Professor Abhishek Amara and Sashi Alawat. I think this is joint presentation. Who will be speaking? Huh? Some, okay. The three person will be presenting this one. Okay. Now we request them to come here and proceed with your presentation.
I think I can speak with this. This will be better.
Okay. Let me introduce you three personalities. Let me introduce first Professor Abhishek Singh Amara. Professor Amar is an archaeologist distinguished for his research on Buddhist monastic remains such as Buddha Gaya. Abhishek Singh Amar is professor of Asian Studies program at Hamilton College, New York. He has held fellowship in the US, Germany, UK, and India, and he has published and co-authored book entitled Archaeological Gazetteer of Gaya District, and he has also published several chapters in edited volume and other journal articles. And likewise, let me introduce Madam Sasi Alawat. Did I pronounce correctly? She is from University of Pennsylvania. She is a historian of pre-modern South Asia. She recently completed her PhD in South Asia regional studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where her dissertation offered a new interpretation of the decline of Buddhism in Eastern India. Sasi is currently an affiliate scholar with the Center for Ancient Studies and at Penn. Okay, and that's all about the introduction.
I can speak with this. I think I can be audible with this as well. You have to do the other one. Yeah. Sorry for you will see me and Sashi doing a bit of dance because we are going to take turns. I'll speak, then she'll speak, then I'll speak again, then she'll speak, and then Professor Kuma will speak, right? So it's going to be a little bit of dancing here, but I hope you will enjoy. So the idea here is, I mean, we've heard a lot this morning about Baha and Bahi, and I was thinking about overlaps and some of the issues that have come up in the conversation this morning that I will like to touch upon. One, I think the workshop focuses on Kriya Sangraha Panjika, I want to think about the relationship between text and archaeology. And I think your presentation, Johnny, was fantastic, where you were trying to compare the two. So I want to think a little bit about that and how, what can archaeology contribute when we think about the relationship when you think about the relationship between text and archaeology. So that's one. And then I want to give you a brief overview of how Buddhist monasteries came into being, how they have been studied through archaeology, and what are the challenges. I hope in that, in order to trace that, I will also be able to highlight some of the key features of Indian Buddhist monasteries and also think about the overlaps that we might see in the Bahabahi of Patan or Kathmandu region. So let me start here. These are some of the issues that I'm going to touch upon. When you think about Buddhist monasteries from archaeological perspective, we think about 3 or 4 distinct regions of South Asia. So the earliest monasteries were supposedly in the Ganga Valley, Ganga region, Gangetic zone, where Buddha is supposed to have lived most of his life, right? So that's one key region that we need to think about. The adjoining region of central India comes next, where you have sites like Sanchi. Unfortunately, most of the monasteries in this area were freestanding. They were made of bricks. Maybe earlier ones of wooden structure did not survive. So when archaeologists go and look for monasteries at these places, they often end up finding structures that may reflect later phases, right? So earlier phases are almost impossible to recover, right? So that's one of the challenges. In contrast, when we go to the Western India, all of these ideas will become more evident when I will show you images and run through these. but I just want to give you a gist so that you can make sense of the structure. But when we travel to Western India, Deccan region, Western Deccan, Maharashtra, Gujarat, we have rock-cut monastic caves. Those have survived, and you can actually see how changes may have been introduced in existing structures over time with the introduction of newer ideas, newer practices, newer forms. So we can think about that, and that in a way helps us trace the transformation, right? Because none of these ideas are static. Monastic architecture has also evolved, changed, and they are varied at any point of time. So I will touch upon that through that example. Then I also want to take you to parts of southeastern India, Andhra, where many of the, Andhra was a major center of Buddhist monasticism, and that region was well connected to Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka. There were continuous dialogues. So we want to think about that region. And many of the monastic sites in that region are essentially hilltop monastic sites, low-rise hilltop right next to the ocean or water bodies, which tells you about the landscape and also connection with agrarian communities, mercantile communities, the secularity that is the focus of our project. So I want to touch upon a little bit upon that. And then I want to talk about from Gupta period onwards, how we notice a certain standardization of form. And then that will help us also think about Nalanda, Vikramshila, all of those major monasteries that I think you have heard a little bit about in the morning presentations as well. And then Professor Kuma will touch upon the overlaps. So next one. So the story begins with this particular monastery, Jivaka Amravan, in Rajgir, which was supposedly donated by Jivaka to Buddha. The site was excavated in early 20th century by Marshall. Marshall went with the text, Xuanzang's account, and he basically ended up assuming that this site belonged to the 6th century time of Buddha. Obviously, when we look at the structure, we can't really make head or tail. There was nothing there. There was no chronology as such. He simply relied on the text to come up with that chronology. So that dating is obviously problematic. Two, when we think about monastic architecture, we tend to think of it as a rectangular or a squarish body, which is not what you see on the ground there, right? But often when you go to the site, since this conversation is also about heritage, this is how the site is presented to the tourists today, right? The narrative. So even the narrative has not been updated, and this is the problem with such sites. So when we come to a site like Vaishali, where early historic monastery has been excavated, two of them actually in this context. In this one, you can also see one of the Ashokan pillars, a water body, and this is right next to a major stupa. You think of Vihāras as a complex where all of these structures were there. And so that's how we need to think about these spaces, because some of this is also evident, I think, in the Vihāra, where the space incorporates ritual and secular space. So again, what we have access to is probably from later centuries, 3rd, 4th, maybe 5th century. That's what we have access to. When we go to Sanchi, again, a site that has origins at the time of King Ashoka, lasted all the way up to 14th century. So what we have here is a standard rectangular squarish form with a central hall, right? But again, this might be a later layer. How do we know this? In order to see this, we need to move to Western India, the Deccan caves that I was telling you about. So Bhaja is one of the earliest sites after Kondivte in the Western India. And here you can see the monastic cells, right? Which may have had some sort of veranda outside. I mean, the part has collapsed, but you can see that this doesn't really match with the squarish structure that we have come to think of as, come to associate with the idea of Buddhist monastery. So this is one of the earliest sites in Western India which has survived. And I mean, if you look carefully, you can also see the railings and things like that that may have been used to decorate the space. Not too far from Bhaja is the site of Karle. And this is one of the earliest sites where we have this squarish rectangular Vihāra structure that we encounter. You have number of cells all around it, essentially. So this is one of the earliest ones that can be actually traced in the cliffs of Western India. And this kind of becomes standard, I would say, from the first century CE onwards. I think these spaces are beginning to have some kind of standard form, as also evident in the site of Nasik, where this monastic cave was donated by royal family, Satavahana royal family and Chhatrapas. And we have 3 inscriptions here. And if you look inside, you have the benches around the cells, and then you have the central, basically, assembly hall. So by this time, you have this kind of standard form. But another side where you don't see this idea being replicated is Kanheri, which continues to exist all the way up to 10th or 11th century. And Kanheri, what you essentially have are single monastic cells. Or there might be two cells put together with a veranda in front, which might remind you of Vihāra actually. So there is no standard. I mean, there is standardization in form, but there are different forms that may have existed in a single region as well. So it is likely that we will notice these might have been part of diverse Buddhist traditions at different places. Going to southeastern India, places like Andhra, it's one of the hilltop monasteries, and you can see that this is where they try to experiment with the material on the ground. So you can see a water river right next to it. You can see the hilltop, and this is a site with a longer chronology, which tells us that they were basically using the local material, but also freestanding structures in order to make the monastery. Again, we don't have anything rectangular here, unfortunately. But not too far from this place is the site of Bavikonda. And Bavikonda, you have standard squarish structure again. So even within a particular region, you are likely to notice these different forms and practices. Another site nearby is the site of Sankaram, site that again started in the early centuries before Common Era, goes all the way up to 10th, 11th century. And here they experimented with both. They had the rock cut caves, and they also had these freestanding structures like this one that you notice here. So you have the rock cut stupa here, and right in front of the stupa is the monastic structure, which is made totally with bricks. So freestanding and rock cut is something that they are experimenting. So I'm talking about this diversity to think about even micro regions where Buddhists are not necessarily conforming to one idea of what it means to have a monastery. It doesn't have to be, they all don't have to, not have to be uniform across the region. I think that's something that we need to acknowledge and think about. Then we come to, by Gupta period, Nalanda. Nalanda is one of the major sites that everybody knows about, square structure. All the monasteries are like that. By this time, we see that standardization in the Buddhist tradition. You will also notice that now we have a central courtyard on the periphery of which we have these monastic cells. You also have the shrine on this side. The entrance on this side, which kind of is on the same axis as the shrine, right? But we need to now also think about the spatial distribution, organization, form, and changes in ideology that are reflected in this design that I want to touch upon briefly. So this standard form this form becomes standard from Gupta period onwards. And then around 8th century, we have the Palas in Eastern India, when we begin to notice this kind of structure where the whole area of the courtyard is about 10, 11 hectares, in the center of which you have a major shrine. And then in each cardinal direction, you might have an image of Buddha or some of the Bodhisattvas, but this whole space is surrounded by monastic cells on each side. Like at Somapura, there were 177, at Vikramshila, more than 200 viharas. Again, this change tells us something about change in ideology, changes in practices, changes in control, right? Projection of authority and power, and then the tantric practices that begin to become part of this tradition. So this is a picture of Vikramshila that I just talked about. One other thing that I also wanted to emphasize was the overlaps that we noticed between Buddhist monastery structures of this time and the Saiva monasteries. You will notice, I don't know how Vihāra is compared with the Saiva monasteries in this region, Nathpanthi monasteries, but that's something that needs to be looked at. I will show you one more example later on from a later period to elaborate this point. Now, when we think about expansion of Buddhist monasteries, the rectangular form, we also noticed that places like Nalanda, where they were able to find two-story monasteries, but that's not the only form. We can see that has been there for a long time at a place like Karle, and then also at a site in Sirpur, central India, where we saw that the monastery was built first, and then they decided to expand that monastery on its western side. So this is the monastery, and I'll talk about the structure and form after Sashi speaks on Nalanda. But you can see when they had to expand the monastery, they decided to basically create parallel structure on the western side with almost the same design. Sashi.
This might, oh, this one you mean? Okay. Is this the right page? Can I just like you hold it in hand? Because I'm only speaking for maybe 1 minute. Okay. Yeah, so I stepped in briefly to talk about Nalanda and how we should also think about multiple phases of construction at a site. There are certain anomalous features at Nalanda that have not been taken in account before, such as, oh, yeah, no, I was just looking at the image also. Such as this pillared hall, there are like similar to how you see in Baha Bahis, you have columned halls. In Nepal's context, you have those in timber, right? In Nalanda, you have stone bases on top of which there would have been wooden pillars. But there is one site number 11, that has stone pillars, and that's an anomalous feature. And I have tried to identify that, date that into 15th century based on other pillars that have been found in the region, such as this, which one do I, here, yeah. So similar to the other sites in the region, such as this Sufi shrine very close to Nalanda, which has a similar sort of pillars. It's not very clear in this image, in these images, but it's very similar sort of motif you see across. And other anomalous features are these these vaults, which are Burmese architecture inspired. And you see similar vaults at other sites also, such as Mahabodhi temple. And this true arch formation, this one is at site number 10 in Nalanda, and that is associated with Indo-Islamic architecture. And you see similar sort of arches at other Buddhist sites as well in the region. So this tells us about the later transformations that happened at Buddhist monasteries, and were kind of integrated with the other trans-regional forms, such as Burma and other Indo-Islamic trends that were going on in the region. And I'll talk more about that towards the end after Abhishek Kumar's.
Okay, so continuing on, we want to think about a couple of issues that I felt overlaps, and I think Professor Prima is going to talk about it as well. But I told you about the entrance, the factor that I want to emphasize, the issue that I want to emphasize here is the visibility and the entrance. So I haven't been to any of the Mahavihara except this one, which I just entered, but the Toranas are supposedly one of the fantastic features, and this is one of the rare ones, a rare monastic site where they were able to find the Torana outside, as you can see in this one. Many of these themes are secular because they essentially talk about couples or Panchatantra fables and things like that, right? On the same axis, you can also see the Buddha image, the central shrine, right? So this reflects a major change in the Buddhist practice of the time when there is a shift from stupas to Buddha images, and Buddha it begins to imagined as a permanent resident of the monastery. Every monastery has a shrine for Buddha. So we have that shrine right here, as you can see, and often the shrine may have an image of two bodhisattvas on both sides. We heard about the Ratna Buddhas early on. And then you might have some normal, common secular themes or figures depicted outside. Similarly, when we think about the organization of space within the monastery, you might have areas like this within the central courtyard. Now there is a drainage in here which comes out on the western side. And this space may have been used for water, which might have been used on regular basis for rituals, consecration rituals in the monastery itself. We have cells on each side. We don't know whether it was a two-story monastery or not, but this is one of the fantastic examples from Sirpur, which was the capital city. Now, Buddha as a permanent resident is something that we noticed not just here, but other places. This is a recreation of the site of Jagjivanpur, where we found inscription donation by one of the military generals of the Pala king, Mahendrapala. Now, one other site that has been excavated recently in Bihar is Lal Pahari from the 9th, 10th century onwards. And at this site, you can see that on all the sites we have monastic cells. That's how we tend to understand them because that's been the pattern. But sometimes you encounter unusual things like here. They found this platform, which everybody thinks are bed, essentially, but there are these different paintings that are there, which makes you wonder, why would they need to paint a bed? right? Maybe it's some kind of mandala design that they're thinking about. Maybe these spaces are used interchangeably for rituals, right? Or even if it is residence, it projects some kind of authority for the resident who was living in that particular cell, right? This is only in 2 cells. So other cells are also colored, but this kind of design is not there. So this is something new that we can think about. I think we heard in your presentation about the color coding and what their meanings could be in this morning. So, oops, why is this not moving? Okay. The last point that I want to talk about is I want to show you 1 or 2 examples from Bodh Gaya. This is actually a Shaiva Dasnami monastery, which has its origins in the 16th century. Many of the Vahabahis have been reconstructed, and I felt there is a little bit of overlap that we can think about here as well. So you talked about the bastion, and you can see some of those bastions, right? This may relate to the fact that these monasteries went on to become major landlords, major landholders, right? So they are trying to project their authority, their power on the landscape, right? Secularity, position themselves like kings, authority. This monastery actually owned more than 5,000 villages at one point of time. They still own about 435 villages. So let's look at the design of this inside. When we look at the inside courtyard, we see a central shrine right here in the middle. This is the central shrine. Right in front of the central shrine actually is the seat of the head of the monastery. There are also secular spaces inside, like this is the space where they bring their produce, agricultural produce from different villages, and they basically are grinding. They're storing things. There are multiple cells. Many of them are for monks, but this is where the head of the monastery lives. Right next to this is the seat of the head of this particular monastery, right? Which again tells you about the projection of authority, power, and how these things may overlap with Vaha and Vahe. Sensei, I think this is where, oh, Sashi, now, I think.
So I don't have any more images, and I'll take us back to the transformations. We have covered a whole lot of transformations throughout time, and I'll particularly take you back to the things that I showed you at Nalanda. And when we look at these sort of late medieval transformations, and that happened across, Eastern India, such as, pillars, true arches, vaulted chambers, and so on, what emerges is a architectural world that was far more interconnected than we have studied so far. And this becomes even more important when turning to Baha Bahi monasteries in Nepal Valley. To make sense of this form, it helps us to think that architecture was not something fixed in a region, but as something that traveled, sometimes through craftsmen, other times through merchants, monks, and sometimes, simply through long distance cultural habits that persisted even after big monastic structures, centers in regions like Eastern India declined. One of the clearest example of this is brick itself. Brick architecture was a key trend in monasteries, especially in the early medieval period. And when we see that occurring in Nepal Valley, such with the Bahas and Bahis built in brick right through the Malla period, it is not just a local preference but also a sign of participation in a wider shared cultural milieu. At the same time, the valley turns brick into something distinctly its own with Nevar craft tradition, especially with the heavy use of timber elements, carved struts, and ornate facades, which is very unique to Nevari tradition. In other words, while the material tradition may be trans-regional, its expression is unmistakably local, especially with the motifs that have been used. The same kind of blending appears in basic layout of Bahabahi complexes as well. Their courtyard-centered monastic plan with cells or chambers arranged around a central open space, which is known as dalans, has clear antecedents in early historic North Indian monasteries like the ones we have covered so far through the earlier slides. Precisely the kind of layout that developed in places like Nalanda and so on. But once this idea reaches Nepal, it is reinterpreted. The courtyard becomes a ritual and social space more tightly integrated into urban neighborhood life. The the surrounding blocks rise to multiple stories, and elements like toranas, chetyas, and carved windows turn what was originally a fairly simple monastic blueprint into a uniquely Nevar urban ritual institution. So again, the plan is trans-regional, but the form it takes is very local. If we consider architectural features such as halls supported by pillars, we see the same patterns emerge. In Nepal, the pillared halls are expressed through carved wooden posts, elaborate capitals, and a strong timber aesthetic, something which is either missing or has not survived in contexts like Eastern India. When we view the Bahabahi architecture in this light, it becomes clear that we are not dealing with an isolated Newar tradition. Instead, these monasteries are part of a much broader architectural context. Understanding this blend of local and trans-regional architectural ideas helps us see the Bahabahi complexes as sophisticated reinterpretation of a long interconnected architectural tradition. Now we move on.
So again, based on their arguments, now I will try to revisit Bahabahi. But let me begin by introducing our keynote speakers, Professor Ryugen Tanemura's informative and inspiring essay on the secularity of Buddhist monasteries as seen in monastery construction rituals. It's including in our Vihāra project newsletter, volume 10, and its English version is also published. In discussing the layout of monasteries, chapter 4 of the Kriya Sangraha Panjika divides them into 4 types and explains the fruit outcome of each. Similar prescriptions can be found in chapter 53 of Varahamihira's Brihat Samhita. Of exceptional interest is the fact that the prescriptions in the Brihat Samhita, an encyclopedic text, do not refer to plans for temples, but to residences for personages such as a king, commanding general, and crown prince. The reason why the layout of palaces should be applied to the layout of monasteries is unclear, but yeah, he assumes that, but this may be a partial expression of secularity of monasteries. So let me start with Professor Tanemura's insights. And Professor Tanemura also compares the Kriya Sangraha Panjika with the 6th century CE Brihat Samhita as follows in his admirable book. The major difference between the two texts is that the Kriya Sangraha Panjika provides us with more information on auspicious and inauspicious outcomes. For instance, while the Brihat Samhita does not mention a house with 1 hall, the Kriya Sangraha Panjika explains outcomes of a shrine with 1 hall. While the Brihat Samhita simply states that a house with 4 halls, of course, a house with 4 halls is far better, is auspicious. The Kriya Sangraha Panjika teaches concrete outcomes specific to each type of shrine with 4 halls. So maybe the author encouraged donors to construct a big house. I assume. Yeah, there is a question. To what extent was the monastery structure described in the Kriya Sangraha was secularized, that is, open to the secular world? So to a considerable degree, should we say? Yeah, based on the results of today's symposium. And in this connection, I would also like to ask the following question also. Whether or not Bahi, which could have been designed for monastic life in its origin, is more closely related to the description of the Kriya Sangraha Panjika rather than Baha. Am I right? Or should we question this thing also? Yeah, and next topic, structural similarities between the Nepalese royal palace as a symbol of secular power and Buddhist monasteries have been discussed in detail by the following Japanese research group, to which Indologists should pay more attention, in my opinion. That is, Nippon Institute of Technology, in Japanese, Nihon Kogyo Daigaku Research Mission. Yeah. And their conclusion, the conclusion of the research group, Japanese research group, is as follows. The examination of the Muchok and the Sundari-chok in the royal palace pattern, as well as the study of the three examples of Vihāra, as we shall see below, serve to clarify the fact that the composition of the wall surfaces surrounding the courtyard were all very much alike. The differences which exist among courtyard type buildings are basically due to the iconological differences in the applied ornamentation. So they emphasize this similarity. And the following list of similarities is also given in their conclusion. First, clear articulation accomplished by the projected or indented wall surfaces within each individual wing. Second, the presence of a visible central axis found within each articulated wall surface unit. Third, the tendency for the different designs of the overall forms of openings in the wall surfaces to establish a central point of visual focus. Yeah, there's another interesting issue. In view of these common characteristics, it can be said that the architectural examples which we have dealt with in this thesis affect the compositional method in which form is derived from the proliferation of individual units. So, yeah, I suppose that this will depend on the expertise and network of artisans at the level of artisan, I mean, in Nepal or maybe beyond Nepal. There should have been a broader network of artisans. And such similarities between the royal palace and three Vihāras, that is, Musiakun, Chushuya, show first that secular power related to Hinduism as well, such as Shaivism and Vaishnavism, is not irrelevant to monastic architecture, and that the network of artisans, apart from the syncretic relationship of different religions at the doctrinal level, should always be considered when dealing with the relationship between Buddhist monasteries and secularity. This is my proposal. Let us turn to another significant study. It's a Japanese scholar's dissertation by Takayuki Kurotsu. It's written in Japanese, but let me introduce his arguments. Yeah, he analyzes the structural features of the Muchok as follows. First, built independently. And I think in that case, the meaning of independence should be questioned. Second, a two-story courtyard style building with an approximately square floor plan. Third, each room on the first floor is independent of the others and is arranged in a row. Four, no structural columns are erected in the room's center or within the walls. Five, the courtyard has a square shape with the lawn on three sides. Six, the courtyard has a north-south axis with the sacred room located at the southern end and the entrance located perpendicular to this axis. The author, Takayuki Kurotsu, points out that the above mentioned 5, that is, from first one to the fifth one, characteristics of the Muchok are shared by Chushu Baha. He also adds that both share the following common characteristics, Chushu Baha, and the eaves of the building surrounding the courtyard are covered with statues of gods. And the recessed part of the wall corresponds to the partition wall position. And this implies that both share the special functions of ritual worship used. Let me introduce another important work on temple design in 6 early Shaiva structures by Ribi Sensei. In this admirable work, plans for different temple types are given in these Shaiva sources, such as so many. Male Mandala Kailasa Bhadragacha Vimana, and so on, so on, and so forth. Vihāra Utapuni, Chaturashya, Oplong, and Britta over. And in this book, the author provides a comparative table of different temple types in different sources, including the Brihat Sanhita, which in turn influence the Kriya Sangra Panchika. So, one of the future tasks would be to trace the origins of Vahavahi using Hindu sources, not only Shaiva but also Vaishnava, as well as the Kriya Sangraha, Panchika. So this is my conclusion or future prospects for our further research. So in the case of India, residence types of kings, ministers, and so on, as described in the Brihat Sanhita, are parallel to shrine types as described in the Kriya Sangraha Panchika. In the case of Nepal, there are structural similarities between the royal palace of Patan, the Muchok and Sundarichok, and the 3 Bahas, Mushyakun and Shusha. Is it a sheer or pure coincidence, or should we proceed to combine these 2 facts? The second option we read us to consider the origins of Vahavahis, as well as the relationship of the Kriya Sangraha with Nepal in a broader context. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, all 3 speakers, Professor Abhishek Amar, Madam Sashi Alaut, and Taiken Kumar, for your pictorial presentation. Very interesting it had been, showing the connection among the Indian monasteries and also to Nepalese monasteries. And I would like to mention some highlights in Nepal Bhasha. Ana yoko kha dai dila someshana khanma tamala somesha नवाओ तस्का नेपिसोन अब पिक्चर के ना तै धाउ जुला अब के तै विशेष याना इंडियन मोनेस्ट्री त गथे जचुन धिउपति ओ नापयुपति रिमनाइन्स त के हुन जुला गुली चाहिँ झिउ बा बै नापन सम्बन्ध दु जिफु जचु दु न के न विशेष ला अनसुले ढाबले तो क्लस्टर अफ मोनेस्ट्रीज इम्था चाहिँ दैउ खनि बा बै झिटा अलग अलग खन्दो इम्था चाहिँ अलग अलग मचुसे छठाए स्वान चुमपति अयाउ योको दु खनि वो चाहिँ झिटा के हुन्छ ल अले चाहिँ अन विशेषना चाहिँ नालन्दा साँची कार्ले नासिक अयाउ ठासे दुपति बा अनिपति मोनेस्ट्री बारे परिचय बिया दिल मेन खर्च अन बोझ अलि इमसा जोड बिउपति त हो ओसपल बिस जोड बिउ ओ सेकुलर एप्रोच तर इमसा सोइ हुन्छ ल अले बृहत संहिता रका गु दुख गु बौद्ध मखु 원나포유 सम्बन्ध चाहिँ नि टुगेदर हाइलाइट याउडु ओके गति सम्बन्ध जचनो थियो छौ चाहिँ थन माक्या बजुबी खन्सुद्राबले बृहत संहिता क्रिया संग्रह पंजिकाई त चाहिँ इन्फ्लुएन्स याउ थे चो गा ताउडु वो चाहिँ समय काल ताउजीमा बृहत संहिता नापो वो लिप क्रिया संग्रह लिप वो जुली ताउजीमा वो छु अन कन्ट्रोल ल अनि मे विशेष ना छु दा त चाहिँ चोक त देखि प्यालेस युपति दरबार स्ट्रक्चर है दयुपति वो चोक तो का वो चोक वो जी बाबई वो चोक नाप यो को मिले जो ख और उल्लेख या जो ल अल विशेष सेना चाहिँ मूल चोक वो सुन्दरी चोक थन ये पति वो जी बाबई युपति चोक नाप कोर्टयार्ड नाप मिले जो ख त्यो उजागर याउ जो ल यो को ख अन चाहिँ थाल बाबई स्ट्रक्चर विस्तार गे चेन्ज याउन त युपति खन उल्लेख जो जो ल अलि वो चाहिँ सम्बन्ध डुगो वो छटासँग मेठा वोपट्टि वो आर्टिसन त्यौपट्टि माइग्रेसन इमो पाकेन वो सिमिल्यारिटी खण्डुगो समानता खण्डु बारे उल्लेख याउ जुल थयावे खय उल्लेखिना ठो प्रेजेन्टेसन जुल तो तस्क ताग स्वे बजु ठुले तासे नाउ